It's a blessing having such wonderful music in this place. Even see the birthday girl, Crystal, singing along this morning. Happy birthday. Am I on here? Or? Yep, I am. Okay. Today we're going to, actually for the next few weeks, we're going to take a break from our journey through the Bible in story form. The story, we're going to come back again to that at the beginning of January. But over this last month, I had the pleasure of being the United Church delegate to the National Restorative Justice Convention that was held in Quebec City this month. And I wanted to come back and share some of what was said there with you here as a congregation, especially as the United Church is so much engaged in the whole work of justice in our country and abroad. This year's conference was a joint conference between Canada and France. Needless to say, with the occurrences that happened in Paris, the French Minister of Justice wasn't able to come, but they sent over a lot of their leading minds in the field of restorative justice, so it was an excellent gathering that was held there. Now, before I go any further, I should really explain to you what restorative justice is, but I'll start with what restorative justice is not. In our traditional legal system, everything is geared towards punishing the offender. The victim has very little or no say in the process. The crime is depersonalized. Whenever anyone commits a crime, it's always against the Queen. So if your house gets burgled and your name is Smith, when it goes to court, it's not the offender's name versus Smith. It's always the offender's name versus Regina. The Queen takes over being the victim for all of us in Canada whenever anything happens to us. And then normally the offender is found guilty or not guilty. If they're found guilty, they're punished and then released and eventually, and the victim has had no input at all normally in the process. Occasionally there's an impact statement, but they really haven't been very involved in what happens with the offender or anything like that. All statistics show that putting people in prison doesn't do anything to stop people going to prison. It just, if you keep raising the amount of time you're going to put people in jail, it has absolutely no deterrence at all on the person committing the crime. So what is restorative justice? Restorative justice is a philosophy that focuses on repairing the harm caused to people and relationships as a result of crime. It's a victim-centered response to crime that provides opportunities for those most directly affected by the crime, the victim, the offender, their families, and the members of the community where it happened, to be directly involved in addressing the harm caused by the crime. Restorative justice, I see, as a river of hope in a sea of pain and violence. It brings back the old values of justice, and it moves beyond liberal or conservative ideologies. Modern-day restorative justice has been closely linked to Christianity ever since it was restarted again in Kitchener and Waterloo by the Mennonite community back in the 70s. But it's not a new thing. Our First Nations have been practicing restorative justice for hundreds of years. It was part of their culture. When someone in a First Nations community in the past used to offend, then the community would gather together in a circle, and the victims would be there, the community would be there, the offender would be there, and they would have a chance to all have input, and at the end the community would decide what happened to the offender, and not a judge or etc. Now that was wiped out in Canada until the late 1970s, early 1980s, when I had the opportunity to be there at the start of it again in the Yukon, where it started again with the First Nations there. The whole idea is to repair harm and find a way to bring the offender back into the community in a positive way. An excellent example of restorative justice was given to us at the conference. The Punky Lake First Nation in BC has an excellent program going. They noticed that they had all these Aboriginal offenders in the lower mainland prisons of BC with nothing to do except get into trouble, and they had communities in around Williams Lake First Nations communities that were so poor that none of the children had beds, and they just didn't have a lot of the essentials of life. And so they decided that they were going to start a program, along with Correctional Services Canada, where they put to work Aboriginal offenders in the Lower Mainland prisons, making beds, making furniture, making toys, all different things that they had them making. And then they would ship those beds and everything up to the communities. And so all of a sudden you had communities who were too poor to get these things. You had men who had nothing to do coming together, and for the first time, children had beds in the community and a place to sleep. One offender stated, "I never had a bed growing up, and knowing that these children can sleep in beds at night brings me great joy." It also had a pretty neat effect inside the prison. All of a sudden, guys working in the wood shop that might sneak out pieces of wood or other things that other offenders wanted would no longer do that because they didn't want to take anything away from the children that they were serving. They also make wonderful toys. I think we have a picture of, there's a rocking horse that they made, which is half horse and half orca on the side, taking in, a culturally appropriate toy to send up to the communities as well. It's a wonderful work that they were doing. And they also make drums and sock dolls that are sold so that the proceedings of selling those were then used to send First Nations children to the Punky Lake camp, where they learnt about their traditions and their customs, and kids who couldn't afford to go to camp were able to go there as well. The First Nations communities say, in our culture, we give people a second chance. We know, I've mentioned before, statistics clearly show that throwing people in prison doesn't work. The United States has proved that beyond any doubt at all. Now, don't get me wrong, there will always be a small minority of prisoners that need to be in a prison. It's not safe to have them in the community, but that is a small amount. And restorative justice is not for everyone. It needs both the offender and the victim to be motivated in the process for it to be able to work. And the number one rule in restorative justice is to do no more harm. The goal is to heal the victim, the community, and the offender, and help that offender become a law-abiding citizen and member of society. I want to give you another example from the conference. A young white man was very upset by the amount of refugees that were supposed to be coming into the country, and so phoned up the local mosque and let loose for about 20 minutes a very nasty, violent, hate-spewing, not conversation because it was one-sided. Anyway, he let loose a whole lot of hate and scared the life out of the poor person who was on the other end of the phone. Then he hung up, and then, not being the sharpest tool in the shed, he phoned the local imam's house, who wasn't home, so he left a message on the machine, and again another horrible message telling him to get out of the country and all the rest of it. Anyway, it was pretty easy to track him down. He'd left enough ways to do that. And if they would have proceeded with the regular, our old-style system of justice, he would have gone to court. Perhaps the imam would have been asked for a victim statement, but possibly not. He probably would have got a small fine, and then he would have been released and still been the person full of hate that he was. But instead, they decided to proceed by restorative justice. And so first of all, the restorative justice practitioners met with the imam and the people from the mosque a number of times, and then he met with the offender a number of times, and then they brought them together. And I can tell you, threat of prison doesn't stop people committing a crime, but sitting someone down in front of their victim and having them sit there and listen to all the hurt that they have caused has a huge impact on most people. And that's what they did. And he had to sit there and he had to listen to all the hurt that he had caused. And then they all gathered together to decide what should happen with this young man. And after consultation, he was ordered to attend Islamic education sessions so he could learn and understand about Islam. He was also ordered to do community service at the mosque, which he did. And then that really fulfilled his fulfillment, his requirement. But then it went a big step further, and still today, this Muslim imam and this Christian young man now go from school to school to school, talking about hatred and prejudice and the need to overcome and understand each other. A much better system than what would have happened. Now, restorative justice also works well on a national scale. I think we all know about the terrible genocide in Rwanda, where over 800,000 people were murdered in a 6-week period while the world stood by and did nothing. The Bishop of Rwanda, was an amazing man, John Runsayana, he himself lost many family members in the genocide. But he stated, "We're building hope, standing on the bones of the past. In all my travels, I've never seen a country's population more determined to forgive and to build and to succeed than in Rwanda." We sent out a lot of restorative justice teams from Canada, especially from the Queens area and stuff, to Rwanda to work with them, and the transformation there is amazing. They also did a very unusual thing. They changed the language of the country. Rwanda was always a French-speaking country, and as part of their total rejuvenation, they switched to become an English-speaking country overnight. But the forgiveness and the hope that is there has been incredible. South Africa, not to the same extent, but has had a lot of success as well with restorative justice and the whole process there of healing. It even works in crimes like murder. I know of a Spanish-American woman whose son was just out. Their son was a good lad. He was 17 and never been involved in any trouble. He was going to the store to get something and just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when a young 16-year-old was being initiated into a gang and was told to go out and shoot the first person that he saw. He went out and shot her son dead. The mother could have dealt with this in so many ways. I think for most of us, we would have been pretty ticked off, needless to say, and not wanted to even see the offender or wanted to see the offender locked up for a long time. The mother started writing to the killer of her son. And she'd write over and over, and she'd tell him her feelings and her anger and how she felt. But she didn't just leave it as that. She then went to start to visit with him. And after visiting for a number of times, she came up with this amazing statement. She said to him, "You've taken my son away from me, and so now you have a responsibility. Now you have to be my son, and I have to be your mother." And that's the way that they have been ever since. And so easy to cripple up and just fall apart in the hatred or the hurt. But they chose the way of restoring and hope and love. The mother's love conquered fear and anger. It might surprise you to know that, like Canada, France is going to be taking in they'll be taking in 35,000 refugees over the coming months and years. After the events in Paris, the French justice system is committed to using restorative justice in working with people in their prisons who have been convicted in terrorism-related offenses. They believe that there's a chance of change. Why? Because terrorists are not born, they are made. And in many cases, they can be unmade. For some, it won't work. For some, it's gone too far. But for others, there's a chance for love to conquer fear and hatred. A grandmother of a 3-year-old girl who was murdered in a racist attack said, "Confronted with so much hate, we need to have a river of love." Confronted with so much hate, we need to have a river of love. One of the most inspirational servant leaders that the Christian church has ever seen was the Catholic nun Mother Teresa. Born into great wealth, she gave it all up to work with the poor and the untouchables. And one of her wonderful quotes had to do with love when she said, "I have found the paradox that if you love until it hurts, there can be no more hurt, only more love." We're living in a complex and troubled world. The terrorist attacks in France and Iraq and Lebanon shook our global sense of security, which was already fragile. Suddenly, people of a certain race or creed are looked upon with suspicion or fear. It's happening in our own country, where Muslim women have been attacked because of the clothes that they were wearing. We have a mosque not too far away that was burnt, and messages of hate that so many have received. This despite the fact that ISIS no more represents Muslims than the Ku Klux Klan represents Christians, or the Saffron terrorists represent Hinduism, or the TNT group represents the Jews, or the 969 terrorists represent Buddhists. I feel this morning that I'm quite qualified to talk about terrorism, having served as a policeman in a city that was under constant terrorist threat and attack for years. I've seen bombs go off. I've dealt with bomb threats, especially leading up to the wedding of Charles and Diana. Shows how old I'm getting. I even guarded the Protestant leader, Reverend Ian Paisley, the day after the IRA tried to assassinate him. When we lived in Zambia, we had Congo rebels coming across the border, which was a kilometer from our house every night. So what did I learn about living with terrorism? The first thing I learned is that the word terrorist is used very unevenly, and that one person's terrorist can certainly be another person's freedom fighter. The second thing that I learned was terrorists normally become terrorists because they've been marginalized or have gone through violence themselves. In Northern Ireland, which I know well, many children grew up to become Protestant or Catholic terrorists after watching their parent or uncle or father be executed in front of them. That doesn't excuse their actions. It just makes it easier to understand how they became radicalized. I also learned that terrorists can change. Many of you were here to hear my good friend John McGregor speak here at Wall Street, a former Protestant terrorist in Northern Ireland and now a renowned Christian speaker and minister. I also learned that you can't let the fear of terrorism make you change the way that you live. If you do that, you let them succeed in doing with the very thing that they wish to do. In England, we used to use the great old World War II slogan, "Keep calm and carry on." Now it's used for everything under the sun. But it was a very important saying. It's a saying of hope. Keep calm, carry on, don't change your lives. It's a statement saying we won't be beaten, we will continue to love, we will continue to hope, we will continue to serve. And finally, I learned that terrorists love to divide people and make them fear each other. And we've seen this happen. The very people who have fled in fear of ISIS or other terrorists often find their way barred because of Western fears. Yes, we have to have border controls. Yes, we need to do our part in stopping terrorism around the world. And yes, we have to punish and then try to restore people who commit acts of terrorism. But I kind of think that Rick Mercer summed it up pretty well this week. I don't know how many heard his rant this week. But if you're passing by a beach and there's a person 50 yards off the beach and they're drowning, you don't stop to think, gee, I wonder if he's a good person. I wonder if he's really drowning. I wonder what religion they are. You throw the life raft, the life preserver, don't you? You do that. I want to end this morning with a very powerful story of one of the speakers at the conference, Mrs. Carmen Quintana. Mrs. Carmen Quintana is now the science attaché at the Chilean embassy here in Canada. She grew up in Chile during the times of General Pinochet, who was a dictator in Chile during the 1980s. During this time, the DENA, the secret police, carried out 3,185 assassinations, imprisoned 28,500 people, hundreds of others went missing, never to be seen again, and over 1 million people were exiled from Chile. As she grew, she became a student demonstrator, as often many do at college. And during a demonstration, Mrs. Quintana and another student were kidnapped by the Chilean army. They were beaten. They both had gasoline poured over themselves. They were then set alight. The other student died. Mrs. Quintana lived through the burning. She was wrapped in a blanket. They drove her 20 kilometers out of town, and she was dumped in an irrigation ditch and left to die. Thankfully, some workers came along and found her. She was rescued, and later on, Mrs. Quintana, along with 10,000 other Chileans, were admitted into Quebec as Chilean refugees. It was actually one of the first mass instant refugee migrations into Canada. And in Canada, she received the extensive treatment for her burns and for her injuries, and along with the other 10,000 Chileans, became valuable members of Quebec society. And she made an impassioned plea for us as a country to show that same generosity to refugees today, and reminded us that after all, apart from the First Nations, we were all come from immigrants or refugees ourselves. Our scripture today said, "My dear friends, we must love each other. Love comes from God. When we love each other, it shows that we have been given new life. We are now God's children and we know Him. God is love." And on this first Sunday in Advent, let us do our part to offer hope in our world as we begin our journey towards the stable, where the Christ child, who himself fled as a political refugee to Egypt, is there waiting with hope for each one of us. May our love conquer fear. Amen. Let's all stand this morning. This is one of my favorite old hymns. I like old hymns and new hymns. We used to, when I was stationed at a Harbor Light, a Salvation Army Harbor Light for a while, where a lot of guys going through treatment, this was the favorite song. A song of just relief, rejuvenation, and it's a powerful, loving song. Let's stand and sing "I'll Fly Away."